Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today I wanted to take the time to talk about E6 Savage, Eden's Gate Fur, because it is one of the fights in this current raid tier that I think was a great addition to the game. Not specifically because of the bosses that we fought, because of the mechanics that it introduced, but because of the style of fight that it is, and also where it is placed inside of the raid tier. Personally, I would have liked to see E6 and E7 switch places, because E7 didn't really feel as difficult as I would have liked, and there are a lot of ways that they could have made E6 a little bit harder for it to kind of like take over the place of E7. But that aside, I do think that E6 being in the place that it was and being the fight that it was is a very good addition to the game, for the very simple reason that E6 is basically a Savage version of an Ultimate Raid, because it basically ticks all of the boxes except its difficulty, of course, because Ultimate Raids are still a whole lot harder than Savage Raids. But if you just look at it stylistically speaking, then E6 is pretty much everything that you would expect from an Ultimate fight. You're first fighting Garuda, then Ifrit, then you're fighting both at the same time, which two boss Savage fights is something that we don't really see all that much. We could say, for example, the ad phase of E1, for example, but they don't really have real mechanics and they're not real bosses that you're fighting, they're more ads. Whereas in E6, you're actually fighting both of the bosses at the same time with tank busters, with other mechanics going on. And then in the end, they fuse together to form Raktapaska or Watermelon Man to be your final boss that will then be your adversary to fight for the rest of that fight. And the reason why I think that this is pretty great is because it gives a lot of players a little bit of a taste of what Ultimate can be like. If we look at other fights that kind of have the same formula as Ultimate fights when it comes down to having, like, for example, double boss fights, or when it comes down to the style of fight where you are fighting kind of a gauntlet, then we're mostly looking at final bosses of a raid tier. Like, for example, the first one I can think of would be Brute Justice, but that one is again final boss of the raid tier. I think Brute Justice is kind of also the blueprint that was used for a lot of ultimates as well, or the template, I guess you could call it. But outside of that, we have O12 Savage, because in the first part, the MNF part of that fight, you're first fighting against, I believe, male first, then he transforms into female, then they split and you fight both bosses at the same time. And then last but not least, Titan is also a fight that I would kind of consider to be like this, because first you're fighting Mini Titan, then he transforms into Big Titan, and then you're fighting both at the same time. Even though Big Titan is not targetable anymore in that final phase, you're still dealing with all the mechanics that he is throwing out. So those three fights are kind of the big examples of what I feel like are Ultimate style fights, or could be Ultimates. Like, for example, Titan, yes, you're technically always fighting the same boss, but it still feels very Ultimate-like as you are cycling through different iterations of that boss, so to speak. So that's why I think those things are really cool, but the drawback of all of them is that they are final bosses for their respective raid tiers, and not everybody is going to be able to experience those, just the same way that not everybody gets to experience Ultimate fights. And I sometimes think that that is a pity, because Ultimate fights to me have always been incredibly fun for what they offer to the table, whether it be unique mechanics or the style of fight that it is, like the gauntlet of bosses that you are fighting, as that is something that you don't really get to see all that often. When we look back on Stormblood, for example, the final bosses of each raid tier was sort of similar like this, where you had to first fight a door boss and then you got to fight the final boss, but there was a checkpoint in between, so you just have to clear it once and then you can just spend all your pulls on fighting the second boss and you don't have to care about the first one anymore. So it actually being a gauntlet style and you starting at the beginning is something that I really enjoyed about E6, and especially its placement in the raid tier itself as well. It being the second fight means that a lot of players, also a lot more casual players, mid-core players, maybe people that are just getting into raiding, they will all get to experience this fight, as you only need to beat Ramuh for it, and then you already have access to it instead of having to go all the way to that final fight in the tier, because I wouldn't be surprised that a lot of people that are watching this video have never cleared a final fight in a tier before, either because they don't have the time investment to spend raiding, maybe they just like to raid casually and just like clearing a fight here or there, and that's all totally fine, which is why I appreciate it that E6 is the second fight in this specific raid tier, because it opens it up to a much wider audience as well, and it could maybe serve as a little bit of motivation for certain players as well that are just getting into raiding, they're experiencing the fight, they're like, wow, this style of fight is something that I really enjoy, maybe I want to try, get better if I find some extra time, like for example during a holiday, for example, like let's say summer break for people that are still going to school, then they can set the time aside, find an ultimate raid static, and then maybe try their hand at an ultimate, whether it be an old one, whether it is the new one that is coming out after the next raid tier as well, because we're still due for one ultimate this expansion. So yeah, that's basically kind of the thing that I'm thinking about when I first saw E6 Savage. It's a great addition to the game because it introduces the ultimate style of fight to a much broader audience, because it is so accessible for everyone to play, because you don't really need to invest a lot of time into Savage to get to that second fight, and it's also not a crazy difficult fight either, so it's relatively simple to just see everything. Also, the fact that there are no independent DPS checks like there are in Ultimate means that you can see the whole fight as well whilst people are dying left and right, and then you can just clean up your DPS towards the end of the fight, where the DPS check finally does start to matter. So I think it's just a really cool addition to the game. That is pretty much everything I wanted to share in today's video. Let me know if you have any fights that you thought were really cool, that introduced something new into the game, or maybe that introduced a specific style that was already there, but that was much more out of reach for more casual players or something to enjoy as well. Let me know in the comments down below. But that's going to be it for me. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me. If you're watching this on the day that it comes out, I hope you have a great weekend as well, and I'll see you in the next one.